Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at this very special event, the public lecture with Lord Stern. The Veolia Institute is proud to be hosting a conference on strategic materials for a low-carbon future alongside the Oxford Martin School. Here in Oxford, we've brought together over 60 leading experts from academia and business to discuss resource availability as the world transitions, hopefully, to a low-carbon future. What resources will this transition require? Do we have them? What will they mean? So we have spent a very intense day discussing aluminum and copper, lithium and cobalt, and looking at the supply side, the demand side, so as to produce, protect, and use these resources efficiently. We don't necessarily know exactly what a low-carbon future will look like, but we're beginning to put together many different pieces of the puzzle, coming from climate science to climate finance, from resource extraction to geopolitics, from social development to economics. And indeed, economics is one of the important lenses through which we can view the low-carbon future. That's why I'm especially pleased to introduce this public lecture from Lord Nicholas Stern, who among his many outstanding contributions has written the most significant and influential report on the economics of climate change. Lord Stern has recently joined us at the Veolia Institute on our Foresight Committee, where he will help us pursue these themes and other key topics at the intersection between society, technology, public policy, economics, and the environment. I now leave the floor to Steve Cowley, Acting Director of the Oxford Martin School. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I'll keep my remarks extraordinarily short because you're in for a great treat tonight. Lord Stern is one of the courageous warriors in the fight against climate change. I think we all know of the Stern Review report, which was one of the most courageous, insightful, and analytic reports that set the world on a trajectory to actually start having the conversation properly about climate change. I think we all owe Lord Stern a debt for doing that and for starting the conversation. Obviously, the conversation is extraordinarily hard and it moves forwards in fits and starts. But as ever, he's in the middle of it, and he's just joined the G20 group of eminent persons, and he was saying, while we were in the green room, he was saying he wants to do things with this and come out with some real changes and not anodyne reports, and that's the characteristic of a Stern report, so we're expecting it from him again. He's the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics at LSE, still very active in economics and in publishing and being an academic, but he's held almost every economics post in the UK government. He's been in the World Bank. It's just such a long list of eminent positions, and in each one, he made an enormous impact. So we're very lucky tonight to have Lord Stern, and I'm looking forward to the talk very much myself. I have to thank him for being on the Oxford Martin School Advisory Board, and he's on Veolia's Foresight Committee, so in a way, he's one of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dinah. Thank you, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be back here. Thank you to the Veolia Institute and to the Oxford Martin School. I've been involved with the Oxford Martin School from the very beginning, and I've just joined the Veolia Institute. It was about 10 years ago that in the examination schools I gave one of the first presentations of the Stern Review. And I think I was about 3 vice-chancellors back. But it's a place where you can really share ideas, and I hope at the end we'll have time for some Q&A. You probably won't be able to read the slides that are going to go up here, but Clara is going to send the slides to everybody who registered. So if there's anybody here who didn't register, you're not going to get the slides. But you could send me an email at the LSE and I'll send you the slides. Now, the task that I want to go to today is to pick up the themes that the conference is examining, is how do you get there? Now, we've said towards a low carbon future. We know actually we mean towards a net zero carbon future, but let's let low carbon stand for the beginnings of that, and you end up eventually with zero carbon. So how do you get there? And I'm going to talk about the areas of action, international collaboration, and something about policies and political will at the end. Just to check, how many of you are economists? Maybe 3-4%. Well, some of the rest of you could have been, but Anyway, so I will try not to assume too much economics. There are little bits of it which have got quite a lot of economics, but they're mostly underneath, and I won't surface them too much, but a bit. So that's the story I want to go through. Where do we have to act? How do we collaborate? What kind of policies? And at the end, how do we generate the political will? Because ultimately, the policies, the institution, the actions will only come if we have that political will, and we have to think about how to make that. But let me just begin by reminding what it is we're trying to do and why. I hope most of you know that already, but I think, I often find that if you try to describe what you have to do, people say, yes, of course, but then when you explain to them the scale and the urgency of what you have to do, things get more difficult, and you say it and they nod and then they go on as if they haven't heard you. So I think it's very important to understand the urgency and the scale, and that's what I'll emphasize in describing what we have to do. So this is the first part of the story, what it is that we're trying to do, the global agenda. Now, it is quite remarkable that we have a global agenda. In 2015, we agreed the Sustainable Development Goals in September at the United Nations, and at the end of that year, in December 2015, we agreed the Paris Agreement, the COP21, with the target of holding well below 2 degrees and best efforts towards 1.5 degrees. We had 195 countries in Paris, 196 because the US has not yet left. It'll take some time to do that. And Nicaragua just signed up. Previously, they weren't in because they didn't think it was ambitious enough. That leaves Syria, which, of course, eventually the United States might join, but we'll see. The Sustainable Development Goals, 193 are signed up. You compare that global agenda of 2015, a forward-looking, collaborative agenda, with the global agenda that we put together after the Second World War. 44 countries prior to decolonization, one very bossy one very powerful one right after the Second World War, and 3 decades where we'd had 2 world wars and a Great Depression. You had to believe that that kind of conflict and devastation that arises from the inability to get together was a bad idea. There was blood everywhere. You compare that with 2015. Now, not 44 countries with one dominant, but 193 for the Sustainable Development Goals, 195 for Paris. It was quite remarkable. And looking ahead and anticipating issues, rather than drawing the obvious lessons from the very bitter experience of the preceding 2 or 3 decades. So it is remarkable that we have an agenda. So as we get, there are going to be waves of optimism and waves of pessimism through what I say. But we should recognize the importance and be optimistic because we were able to put those agreements together. What were they based on? And again, you don't have to try and read all this, but you'll get them and then you can read them. What was it based on? It was based on two things. It was based on an understanding of the enormity of the risks of climate change. I mean, we haven't seen 3 degrees centigrade for around 3 million years. We haven't seen 4 or 5 degrees centigrade for perhaps 10, 20, 30 million years or more. But just take 3 degrees and 3 million. The Paris targets for 2030 are roughly consistent with a 3-degree path. That's why in Paris people agreed that they had to work within 5 years to ramp up the ambitions of the targets to do much better than that. There was honesty there. They recognized that the plans that they'd got, country by country, if you added them up for 2030 for emissions, were something which was inconsistent with the declared goal of well below 2 degrees. So the next 3-4 years, because we're already 2 years on from Paris, the next 3 years or so have to be years where we work out how to ramp up ambition. So this discussion that we're having now, that the discussion of the conference, has to be crystallized into extra ambition by 2020 when we come together to see how we're going to ramp up those ambitions to be consistent. So this conversation now is absolutely critical to what happens. So 3 degrees we haven't seen for 3 million years. Even 1 degree centigrade where we are now, all this is increase in average global surface temperature since the end of the 19th century, which is the usual way of measuring. We haven't seen 1 degree centigrade for perhaps 100,000 years. We're already going slightly beyond the Holocene period, which was a very benign period where we grew up and we turned grasses into grains and we sat down because we had to wait for the grains to come to harvest. So we had settlements and we had surpluses so we could have universities and all that sort of thing. And we had storage so we didn't have to go out gathering and hunting every day. That's where we grew up. That's the last 10,000 years or slightly less since the warming up. And we're already on the edge or moving outside that very benign temperature period. 3 degrees centigrade, the sea levels were probably tens of meters higher than now. Now, those things go slowly, but they can go quickly if you see very rapid melting of land ice. And of course, all the storms and hurricanes that we're already seeing that come with it, and the movement of the deserts, the inundations, and so on. We're talking about, at 3, 4, 5 degrees, we can't say exactly where, but we're talking about very big populations having to move, probably hundreds of millions or billions of people, and that would lead to extended, if history tells us anything, that would lead to extended and severe conflict, and we wouldn't have the means to turn off the cause of the conflict. So it's very important to recognize the stakes that we play for. And I'm embarrassed to say that the economic models of generally of all this really do not embody the stakes that we're paying for. At 5 degrees centigrade, some of these models have you might lose 5 or 10% of GDP. I mean, give me a break. It's just not coming to terms with the size of the risks that we're talking about. So what happened during this build-up of understanding, which led to this agreement in Paris and the Sustainable Development Goals, was an understanding of the enormity of the risk. But what I think was the clinching difference between Copenhagen 6 years before and Paris in 2015 was the understanding of the growth story. What we're talking about here is the growth story of the first half of this century. We don't run growth to infinity. What's the point? What we're talking about here is how we can grow in a sustainable, attractive way for the next 40 or 50 years as we try to lift the very large number of people in the world out of poverty. So that's the story, and what we came to realize, and many of us were working exactly on this, and the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate put out a report on better growth, better climate in 2014, the subject being a pretty obvious statement of what the report contains. But if you just think of it in terms of the short, medium and longer run in terms of growth, in the shorter run, what we do through sustainable infrastructure investment, which is at the heart of the story, we boost demand and we sharpen supply over these next few years. We spark off a quite extraordinary era of innovation, investment, creativity and growth, a kind of Schumpeterian story of economic history and waves of technological change in the medium run. And we can already see that happening and beginning to happen. And of course, in the long run, there is no high carbon growth story. High carbon growth, any attempt at that sets off an environment so hostile that actually development is reversed and we lose many of the gains, the great gains of the last 30 or 40 years. So the thing, I think, the biggest difference between Copenhagen in 2009, COP15, and Paris in 2015, COP21, Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was that understanding that this wasn't a horse race between climate responsibility and rising living standards. Quite the opposite. We had to and we could put those two together. That was a fundamental part of all this. Well, what do we have to do to stay well below 2 degrees? Well, if you're going to stabilize temperature, you have to stabilize concentrations. If, God forbid, you stabilize concentrations at 4 degrees centigrade, so concentrations stop rising, but they were at a very high level, you'd have to be net zero. If you stabilized at 3 degrees, you'd have to be net zero. Right? So what we're saying here is you've got to get emissions, net emissions down to zero if you're going to stabilize temperature. What we're talking about when we talk about 4 degrees, 3 degrees, or 2 degrees, or 1.5, is when we go net zero. And to go well below 2 degrees, we're going to have to go net zero 50 or so years from now. So we're going to have to cut emissions drastically by using much less energy per unit of output, produce that energy in a very different kind of way, and we're going to have to find ways of going negative. Net zero means net zero. So if there's some positives, there've got to be some negatives. So we've got to think about how to do the negatives, and that is an area of discussion which I'll refer to. So I've described the risks, I've described that this is the growth story and potentially very attractive, including cities where we can move and breathe and be productive and ecosystems that have some chance of survival and so on. This is a very attractive story and we know how to begin it and we'll learn an awful lot on the way. But we've got to realise that it's a radical story and we've got to go net zero within 50 years or so. Delay is dangerous. Well, delay is dangerous because you lock in high carbon infrastructure and capital if you delay. And of course, this is a ratchet effect. The flow of emissions increases the concentrations, and it's very hard to reduce the concentrations. Delay is very dangerous. It's very important because this is an area that's full of uncertainty. And sometimes, if you have uncertainty, it's a good idea to wait and see. Other times, and this is a huge example of the other times, it's very dangerous to hesitate because you make the problem so much worse, indeed probably uncontrollably worse if you delay for 20 years or so. So this next 10 or 20 years is absolutely of fundamental importance. If the world economy grows at 3 degrees, if the world economy grows at 3% a year or so, then it would double in roughly 23 years. The number of years, it doesn't matter if, for this argument, whether it's 18 or 28. What we're going to see is a world economy that will double in the next 2 decades or so. The infrastructure in that world economy will way over double in the next 2 decades or so. If we get that wrong, if the next economy coming in alongside the one we have in the next 20 years looks anything like the one we've got now, you can forget about 2 degrees, probably forget about 3 degrees. If the infrastructure looks like the infrastructure we have now, similarly, because that's going to more than double. So what we have to be very clear is that this next 2 decades is absolutely fundamental, so the decisions we take now are fundamental because they will shape what happens in this next 2 decades. We are in a hurry. I mean, we can see what to do, but we're really in a hurry, which means that these kinds of discussions have to lead strongly to policy. There's some good signs, and I'll come to them, but it's not coming fast enough. We're sort of winning the argument, but we're not winning the argument about the speed of change and the nature of change. Think about the world's cities. We are now about 50% of 7.5 billion people in towns and cities. That's roughly half of 7.5 is 3.75 billion people. We will be 70% or so of a population which is close to 10 billion people 30 or 40 years from now. So we're going to go from 3.75 billion people in towns and cities to something close to 7, a close to doubling of our cities in the next 3 or 4 decades. Again, decimal points don't matter for the thrust of this argument. You can see that if we make those cities roughly like the cities that we have at the moment, we'll be in deep trouble, because that will be where the bulk of emissions come from. So this next 10 or 20 years is absolutely vital. So I've gone through the global agenda, I've gone through what we have to do and why we have to do it in terms of emissions and what change we have to make. And I hope it's clear that this is radical change, but potentially enormously attractive change, and we really are in a hurry. And the urgency and scale point, I must say, I often find very frustrating. Because if you say what I've just said about the world economy doubling, the infrastructure more than doubling, it's absolutely crystal clear that we have to tackle this in the next 20 years. And you say that to people, and they nod and they say, yes, Nick, you're quite right. And then they go on talking as if they haven't heard anything. So we have to be persistent. Persistence and consistency and clarity, that's what we have. Now, let me now move into and I have to go quickly through this. I want to, in this section of what I have to say, talk about the areas of action. And then I'll talk about the international collaboration. Then I'll say a bit about policy. Well, if you just look at the numbers, I mean, this is the International Energy Agency on CO2 emissions from energy. But the big parts of the story on energy, and it should be fairly obvious, but if you run the numbers, it's very clear, are energy efficiency, the productivity, if you like, of energy, and going to zero carbon energy, in large measure. The big green slice is the renewables. Nuclear and CCS are down in that story as well. And in my view, this is such a big problem, we've got to use everything that we've got and explore it all. But you can see that numerically it looks as if the really big things are energy productivity, if you like, more generally resource productivity, which is very much the subject of this discussion here, and going to renewable sources of energy. We are moving much too slowly as a world in terms of the kind of annual rate of increase of energy productivity that we need. We may be moving at around 1.7% or so a year in terms of energy productivity, and we really would need something like 3% a year on that front. That's a very big change, but that's the kind of subject that we're dealing with in this conference. Energy productivity is, in terms of the amount of energy you need per unit of output. I won't go into the sources and sinks, but this diagram is all taken from the work of others, and in the handout, the references are all at the end, so the references are included in the end of the slides. But the oceans currently sequester about 26% of CO2 emissions, and the land-based sinks about 31%. They take in a lot, but of course, as we take in more and more CO2 in the oceans, we're decreasing the capacity to take in more. So we're going to have to work very hard on looking after our sinks, and there's lots of, probably the oceans is going to be particularly hard, but there's lots of research now on land-based sinks and how we can improve. I mean, soil is dark because it's got carbon in it. The more carbon we get into the soil, the more productive it's likely to be. And there are lots of ways in which that kind of discussion is developing. We've got grasslands all over the world that probably could absorb a lot of carbon. This is the kind of research that we need to do. This isn't a talk about the oceans, but as time goes by, you get more and more worried about the health of the oceans. I've just emphasized the oceans as sinks because there's much more to worry about the oceans than their sinks of carbon, big enough though that worry is. And of course, I don't have to tell you about plastic bottles. The natural climate story, and this is, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper that came out this year, looking at the potential of the different sources here. Now, if you're really, really optimistic and use everything that's available, you could, in principle, according to this, sequester in natural sinks maybe over 20 gigatons a year. Now, that's a big stretch, and the black lines here, of course, are far lower than that, and even the black lines you'd be doing extremely well. This isn't a story where you should take these numbers too seriously, but it is a story that says if you can sequester several gigatons a year when we're emitting 50 gigatons or so a year in this way, that's really worth having. You've got to operate on all the slices of a few billion that you can, and this is potentially one part of the story, and it's potentially a part of the story where research could be very productive. I know the economics research is the most important, but there's huge amounts of science and technology in all this. This is taken from the wonderful I assume Ellen MacArthur's not here, but this is taken from, those of you who want to go down to the Isle of Wight should visit Ellen MacArthur's foundation, and they've looked and they've shared it with others. Is Martin Stuchty here? Is Martin? Yeah, Martin's here. I mean, Martin and his collaborators have been working on that too. This isn't the time to go into detail. The conference is doing this. But when we put concrete around steel in our buildings, think how difficult that makes it to get the steel out. If you designed it in a way that you could dismantle it and reuse it and thought about that from the beginning, you've made a huge difference. Now, that's just one big example. Those examples are everywhere. And people like Martin and Ellen MacArthur and many others now are looking into how we design into what we do, making it far easier to reuse, including the social arrangements, the physical design, all kinds of things, and of course the incentive structure. 5p on a plastic bag makes an amazing difference, and you all experience that. So there's the economics, there's the design, there's the science, there's so much, there's the architecture, so much is going to go into this circular economy story. It's intellectually fascinating and potentially of great importance. And remember what I said about energy productivity and how far we are moving. We're energy productivity moving at 1.7% a year, we need 3%. This is part of that story, it's resource productivity. This is taken from the Energy Transition Commission, which I'm one of the members of, and there, under the leadership of the chair of Adair Turner and Ajay Mathur, who's head of TERI in Delhi, looking at the detail of what we do and how we can do it. Again, I haven't got time to go into the details of these changes, but the cheerful story is there are lots of very good people now coming up with real levers to pull, places to press that can start to produce big results. Cities are a huge part of that story. I've already mentioned about the population in cities doubling in the next, or close to doubling in the next 35 years or so. The area that's in towns and cities is going up even faster. In many countries around the world, what you see is that the population density of cities is going down, whilst the population of cities is going up very rapidly. That means, of course, that the cities are expanding very rapidly in terms of their size, and that's hugely inefficient. And we had some fun in the new climate economy report, Better Growth, Better Climate, comparing Barcelona and Atlanta. Is anybody here from Atlanta? Well, I'd probably go on with this story then. Essentially, if you look at the populations and the incomes per capita of Barcelona and Atlanta, they're pretty similar. But of course, emissions in Atlanta from moving around are something like 10 times what they are in Barcelona. And the last sentence of the paragraph is, where would you prefer to live? So we can understand city design, but we can't turn just by flicking our fingers Atlanta into Barcelona. So there are lots of big questions about how you restructure your cities, how you organise the transport in cities, but tremendous opportunities there, and people moving very fast. More and more cities, Oxford perhaps not too far away, you're going to have no internal combustion engine vehicles before too long. It's remarkable, the pace. In India, by 2030, they're not going to sell internal combustion engine vehicles. Who would have thought that 10 years ago when we published the Stern Review? Who would have thought that the head of Ford and other big companies are saying the era of the internal combustion engine is over? Yeah? Nobody's going to build a coal-fired power station in the United States, regardless of who the president happens to be. The way in which the technical opportunities are changing, and the way in which people see those opportunities, and the kinds of cities they want, have changed quite dramatically in 10 years. That was a wave of optimism, but remember, always we're not moving fast enough. But the cities will be absolutely fundamental to this whole story. Now, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, that's rather a lot of goals, but nevertheless, they're basically around the same kind of ideas that were in the Millennium Development Goals. Millennium Development Goals are about poverty and income space. They were about education and health and environment and collaboration. These were basically the Millennium Development Goals. And what the Sustainable Development Goals do is to unpick that a bit. And they go much more deeply into inequality kind of issues, city kinds of issues, oceans, and that sort of thing. So they're actually quite a logical and healthy development of the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals really changed the agenda in a big way. Aid organisations got behind them. My dear friend Patel is right here. When we were working together at the World Bank, we really saw the way in which the definition of the goals was set out and the various measurements associated with those goals. It really did change what people did in a very constructive and important way. The Sustainable Development Goals will do the same thing. Now, what I want to emphasise here is at the heart of these is sustainable infrastructure. It's absolutely fundamental. You know, if you improve water supply, you make life much better for women and girls. They don't have to go so far, and that's obviously often a very dangerous activity as well. If you improve public transport and reduce air pollution in cities, you boost the employment opportunities of poor people enormously. Poor people travel furthest and they're hit hardest by air pollution. Wherever you look, the sustainable infrastructure is at the middle of all these Sustainable Development Goals. It's the fundamental part of the story. World infrastructure investment is a bit over $3 trillion a year. In 6 or 7 years, that will grow over 15 or 20 years into $6 or $7 trillion a year. The key is how you do it. It's going to grow roughly like that anyway. Do you make it sustainable? Do you make it clean or not? Now, President Trump, who I'm not obsessed with, is declared himself quite rightly for a strong increase in infrastructure. And he's talking about development banks and so on to stimulate that. Now, we assume that you mean modern, that beats outdated. We assume that you mean clean, that beats dirty. We assume you mean smart, that beats dumb. And we assume you mean resilient, because that beats fragile. So that's an agenda which people, I think, can quite easily get round. Seeing sustainable infrastructure absolutely at the core and emphasising the adjective as well as the noun. And I think that is a very important part of a story which we're starting to make great progress on. Now, let me turn now to what's going on around the world and say something about collaboration. I've already emphasised the importance and the remarkable nature of the international action that we got. The emerging market countries, in terms of the numbers around sustainable infrastructure, are just the biggest. Now, they're going to be 70% of growth, they're going to be 70% of the infrastructure and so on. Africa is going to see by far the biggest increase in population in this story of the next 30 or 40 years. So you can see where the big action in all this is going to come. So what we've seen, actually, it's been a remarkable change since Copenhagen, is that the emerging market and developing countries are now out in front. Just 6, 7 years ago, this whole story was seen by many people in the developing world as a kind of rich country conspiracy to stop them growing just at the moment when they were starting to move. And that has, I think, not gone away, because it is true about the historical responsibility of the rich countries getting rich on high carbon activities. But what you're seeing now is, throughout the developing world, more and more leadership of what needs to be done and how to do it. And I worked very closely for many years with Melissa Nawe at the COP that was in Durban, the African COP that was before Marrakesh. I was on a platform on Africa Day with Meles and other African leaders, and he said very clearly and strongly, it is not justice to foul the planet because other people have fouled the planet in the past. And those were his words and his language. And that kind of morality, together with the recognition of the huge opportunities that lie in low carbon growth, and the recognition that now, of course, the bulk of emissions, just through the process of growth, comes from emerging market and developing countries, has completely changed that debate. And we look to the emerging market and developing countries, not for all the leadership, far from it, because there's a huge historical obligation from the rich countries, and there's the technology, and there's the wealth. But this is now very much a shared leadership. The story of United States, I shouldn't go on too long about this, but basically the world has passed the Trump test. I was in Marrakesh in the November last year, right after the election results came in. Country after country stood up and said, we are getting on with this. This was 1 year after the Paris Agreement. We're getting on with this because A, it's the right thing to do, and B, this is the growth story. This is the inclusive growth story of the future, and we can see how to do it. It was quite remarkable. And you saw at the G20 in Hamburg that all the countries, let's call them the G19, apart from the United States, said that Paris is irreversible. Now, those of you who know G20 language, that's a very powerful word for the G20 to use. And the whole of them, including the United States, declared for that the objective of the G20 was to promote strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Those 4 adjectives do matter. And that was the overall statement. So it is remarkable how the world, when challenged, has just said, we're getting on with it. And so much the United States has said the same thing to states and cities and companies. Now, this was not a good thing. Don't get me wrong. It has probably net slowed things down. But on the whole, we've passed that test, and many of our friends and colleagues and big players in the United States have passed that test too. And Jerry Brown, the wonderful governor of California, and Tom Steyer, a big Californian investor, have taken the rent, they've rented out what would have been the USA Pavilion at Bonn, and are having a gathering, as it were, for the We Are Still In story. And of course, the United States is sending a delegation to Bonn because they haven't left. And they can't leave because in the Paris Agreement, you couldn't leave for 3 years, and then you had to give notice of 1 year. If you put that together, it's just a few days after the next presidential election. So I've emphasized the story of the middle-income countries and developing countries, how important they are and how much they're doing. China peaked coal about 3 years ago. They may be peaking energy consumption about now. In Paris, they said they'd peak their emissions by 2030. I think they'll probably peak them by 2020. Just possible they might have peaked them, but probably not. But they probably will peak by 2020. And if you look at President Xi Jinping's speech at Davos in January, and the slightly longer speech that he gave in the 19th Party Congress, the words environment and climate appeared more often than the word economy. This is, and there was a very clear articulation of Chinese leadership. China had already become a leader, actually, but it's been more explicit in the last year. India, I've already said, is moving tremendously fast. Just a few months ago, a competitive auction for electricity in Rajasthan came in at 4 cents per kilowatt hour, somewhat below coal, even without sensible carbon pricing. So you've got there a story of country by country around the world. Mexico, in its big tax reform, introduced a carbon price. I've already mentioned Ethiopia and so on. There is movement in so many big, important places around the world. Now, I've spent 10 years of my life as chief economist, first of a regional development bank, then of the World Bank. And they really, so you have to allow a little bit maybe for bias here, but they can make an enormous difference. Currently, they're lending about $70 billion a year. And a big chunk of that, maybe 40 billion in infrastructure. If you doubled their capital and you adjusted the gearing ratios from 1 to 1.5, that means instead of being able to lend out right up to their capital, which is extremely conservative, it's a 1-to-1 gearing ratio, if you relax that to 1.5, you could triple their lending capacity. That would start to take the infrastructure investment that they could fund to something like $150 or $200 billion a year. If you then have a multipliers through collaboration with private sector of something like 3, that could take you to those investments that they're involved with as somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion, or maybe $400 to $800 billion. If you then set that in the context of infrastructure investment that's growing from a bit over $3 trillion a year up to $6-7 trillion a year, you can see they could be present in 15 or 20% of these activities. That's enough to have a very big influence. So this could be a very powerful part of the story. You can double their lending capacity, as I described, probably by a one-shot injection of around $50 billion. One shot. That's everybody. And you can spread it over a few years. That is, in this context, absolute peanuts. One shot, $50 billion, together with the adjustment in the gearing ratio, you could triple the lending capacity. It's absolutely mad not to do that. And I hope that in slightly less expansive language, when we come to the report of the G20 Eminent Persons Group, we'll say something not dissimilar from that. And of course, I've focused on finance, but institutions and sharing ideas on innovation and carbon pricing, which I haven't emphasized yet, but is a very important part of this story. Joe Stiglitz and I, working with others in the room, Cameron Hepburn and others, worked on a report which recommended that, or which articulated the kind of carbon pricing that you need, along with other things to go with it, of course, to deliver on Paris. And we reckoned $40 to $80 per tonne CO2 by 2020 and 50 to 100 by 2030, along with the other things, of course. Putting in a carbon price doesn't redesign a city. You know, even the most delusional economists couldn't think that just setting that price gave you all the change that you need. But it's a very powerful driver of that change, along with city design, along with various forms of regulations and targets, and along with investment in R&D and innovation and so on. So that's a very important part of the story. So here is the slide that's got lots of economics in it. So I'm going to just, my last 4 slides, 2 on policy and then 2 on political will. When we spoke in the Stern Review, we spoke about it, the lack of pricing for greenhouse gas emissions as essentially the biggest market failure the world has ever seen. We're all involved in it, we're all emitting the greenhouse gases, and we all will suffer from it, and the magnitude of the potential suffering is immense. That qualifies as the greatest market failure that the world has ever seen. But it's not just that. That's fundamental, and I put it first. But there are other fundamental market failures too. Research and development in this area, innovation, is of enormous importance. And the idea, of course, is a public good. Success or failure are public actions which people learn from. And in this case, because we're in such a hurry, and in this case, because the use of the invention benefits everybody, not just the profits of the person who's used it, this argument about R&D is particularly important in this area. We all know from the last 10 years or so how badly capital markets work. We're talking about markets for allocation of risk, in a lot of it in the long term. Of course, now high carbon is much more risky than low carbon, and we're working to make it even more so. But the whole story of how capital markets handle risk, and I emphasized just now development banking. Development banking is of fundamental importance here. The presence of a development bank reduces risk. Because government-induced policy risk is less worrying. The presence of a development bank allows people to come together in a way that might not happen so easily if it was Goldman Sachs that rang you up and said, I've got a great opportunity for you, just give me your money, I'll look after it. The development banks pull people together. They develop skills. The best place to go for energy efficiency probably in the world now is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and how to finance it. So the development banks play a very powerful role in all this. A lot of this is about networks, broadband, electricity grids, public transport, recycling and reusing, combined heat and power. A market just by itself can't work. It needs a framework. That doesn't mean public ownership, but it needs a framework with which it can operate. So networks are very important. Information is very important. You've got to know what you're buying. You don't want to buy a carpet that's made by child labour. You don't want to buy goods that are made in very destructive ways. But you need the information. We're getting better on that, but you need that too. Finally, there's this very, very bland word, co-benefits. But we kill, through air pollution, millions a year, particularly in the developing world. We kill 40,000 a year in the UK from air pollution. We kill 1,700 from road deaths. And that 1,700 is terrible. We make a big fuss about it. But what about the 40,000 that we kill from air pollution? And those of you who like to play with numbers, if you take the fraction of population that you kill each year, and if you call that K, if you take M, which is the multiplier on GDP per capita that takes you to the statistical value of a life, a crude concept, but one that's used a lot in road transport, medical, and so on. So fraction killed, the multiplier on GDP per capita that takes you to statistical value of life, you multiply those two together, and it's just a one-liner, just you do the arithmetic. It really is a one-liner. You get the fraction of GDP lost associated with those deaths. Take the UK. Well, K is at least 1 in 2,000. But I mean, if it was 30,000 in the population of 60 million, that's 1 in 2,000. Roughly speaking, the multiplier we generally use on GDP per capita is similar across countries is 100. 100 times 1 over 2,000 is 1 over 20. The UK loses on the basis of that kind of rather crude but suggestive calculation 5% of GDP a year on air pollution. We are not the worst, and that doesn't count the sickness, that's the death. This is a huge thing. It's a little tucked in at the bottom of these 6 things as co-benefits, but it's immense. And having cities where you can move and breathe is a huge story. And we're killing people on a vast scale now through hydrocarbons, and we're killing people on a vast scale down the track. That seemed to be a bad idea. And the point is we know what to do. So there's loads of economics in these things here. That's the most economic of the slides, and it's not just the right policies, it's the credibility of the policies. Government-induced policy risk is the biggest killer to investment around the world. So we have to find a way of learning and changing and doing things differently whilst being predictable. So the language I use is that we have to be predictably flexible. So you don't put in support for renewables in order to get people to adopt renewables more quickly, in order to encourage innovation in renewables, and then suddenly notice that you've been successful and whack, take it away in one go. You say, this is here to encourage the use of renewables and to have innovation, and as we move down that path, we will reduce the subsidies in this kind of way. So that's what I mean by being predictably flexible. Learning is fundamental to this whole story. We're doing this in all the things we do are in part to encourage this kind of learning. So we better say when we introduce policy how we're going to use that learning in adjusting policy. So this is the last few words I want to say is about building commitment. We need tremendous leadership. We're starting to see it in some parts of the world. So in my optimistic moods, the next slide is more pessimistic. So I oscillate as to which, but I'm going to end on a slightly pessimistic note. But let me wax a bit optimistic before I do. That is that you're seeing tremendous movement around the world, great understanding of the growth story, deeper understanding of the policies. We now know that we've got a very good chance, if we're really serious about all this, in realizing this growth story of the future, in meeting the Paris targets. We really can. We can see how to begin. We know we're in a hurry, but we can see how to begin, and we can be pretty confident we'll learn like mad along the way. We have this in our hands now. Perhaps we didn't 10 years ago, but we do now. We can see what to do, and it's enormously exciting, and we're beginning to have the international collaboration to make it happen, as I emphasized. We're beginning to see the leadership right around the world, more in emerging market and developing countries in many ways than in the rich countries. There's a really optimistic tale to be told here, but will that political will crystallize fast enough? Well, that's in large measure up to us. We're communicators, we live in, and researchers, and we work in universities. But it's not us by ourselves, but we have a deep obligation to analyze and work and understand and take these stories out. But so do a lot of other people. Some people, my father, you can tell by my name, my father would never have thought I'd stand up and praise a pope. But the Pope has quite an extraordinary ability to communicate on this issue. Now, if we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. Now, you might sit here and logic chop about creation for a bit, but actually the story there, it's a fast statement that is broadly correct. God always forgives, people sometimes forgive, nature never forgives. Another line from the Pope. Now, again, you can logic chop and pick and so on. But basically what we need is very clear, strong messages that you can get into a sentence which are basically right. We don't want clear, strong messages that you can get into a sentence that are basically wrong. Now that would not be good. But that's the kind of way we have to learn. We have to press, and particularly young people have to press decision makers. We have to build that political will. As academics, our duty is to build a political argument, build the analytical, economic, scientific, technological arguments that can support the action. That's our job. And we have to communicate it in a direct way. But we also have to be part of something much bigger. Thanks very much. I'm told we have about 13, 14 minutes for questions, and there are roving mics. Can I just tell you before I don't know what you do at Oxford, but there's an LSE tradition that you seek gender balance, so bear that in mind. A gentleman just here.
Sangwon at the UC Santa Barbara. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. Very much appreciated. My question is about the growth and the sustainable investment argument, which I think is very attractive and especially particularly palatable for politicians and voters and investors, that we need to grow at the same time, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. By doing so, politicians are happy, bankers are happy, investors are happy, and voters are happy. But at the same time, the argument there is that, well, we need growth because we need to bring the world out of the poverty. But at the same time, we know that we have observed that, well, for many countries, as we grow, the income inequality has been widened. I wonder, what if after 20 years, still countries like in Africa, India and Pakistan, Latin America still need growth because they couldn't come out of the poverty. And what it can do, if they say, well, we need to grow triple, double, triple, quadruple our economy, and how can we get out of the conundrum?
Thank you. Can I take 3 questions at a time? And please, this lady at the front here.
Good evening. I'm Sheila. I work for the World Bank. So I was going to ask you on the subject of political will, because if you wish, the core business of politics is to entice the electorate. In countries where the sort of issues that we are discussing here may be too complex to resonate with the average person, enough to align them to the politician, what then is political will in that space? How do they surmount the political will that also allows them to stay in business, in other words?
One more. There's a gentleman right at the back there in the corner. And I'll try and get round for another 3 if I can. Yeah.
My background is in water science, and I've recently been set a research task of answering the question, how much more fossil fuel can we afford to burn? So I started with your review and tried to understand how economics works, and I'm just honestly more confused than when I started, I think. But given that this essay is due at midday tomorrow, how would you answer the question of how much more fossil fuel can we afford to burn?
Right. I don't think there's an inexorable relationship from growth to inequality. In fact, there's quite a lot of, and we shouldn't be too heavy about how it goes one way or the other. There's a great deal of choice in these things. Probably on balance, less unequal societies have a better chance of growing more quickly. But, it can go either way. But what I wouldn't accept is that there's an inexorable relationship between growth and inequality. There's quite a strong relationship between growth and poverty reduction. Again, you've got to not to be too mechanical, but that's a pretty powerful one. And in China, which is the biggest example of poverty reduction we've ever seen in the world, with hundreds of millions being lifted out of poverty over the last 30 years, growth was a big part of that story. The key thing here is to break the relationship between economic activity, production and consumption, and the destruction of the environment, including of the atmosphere and the greenhouse gases. You've got to break that relationship. You don't break growth, you break the relationship between growth and the physical environment that we live in and the one we give to our children. And I've been trying to argue that we know how to do that, and we should do that. Political will, I gave the Pope, that's a big example. Those of you who remember Barack Obama's speech in Chicago on the night he won the election, and the lady, I think she was called Alice Nixon Cooper, she was 100 and something like that. She was 103, 104. And he asked, what kind of world, if my girls lived to her age, what kind of world will they see? If you look at the pressure that young people bring to bear. If you ask people coming into universities, actually, particularly in economics departments, what it is that you want to understand, they will say inequality and sustainability. So I think that there's a natural swell from underneath. One of my friends in expansive mood after a few beers told me that the future of the planet lies in the geography teachers at school. But the young people really understand much more about this than many old people. So we're talking about leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, people who teach. It's our job to teach too. And of course, and political parties and so on. So I don't despair about this becoming a really big issue. People understand pollution, people understand storms, people understand desertification. And so they can see what we're talking about. Now, at 1 degree centigrade, in the words of another president, Ronald Reagan, you ain't seen nothing yet. If we got to 2 or 3 degrees, it would dwarf what we see now. But you can see some of the straws in the wind. Al Gore actually is pretty good at seeing straws in winds if you look at some of his movies. So this is about communication in all kinds of different ways. I've given schools and cinemas and religious leaders and political leaders, and it's our job too. So I wouldn't despair of that. But one thing you can be sure is if you're deeply pessimistic and despairing and you persuade other people to be like you, then your predictions will probably be right. Yeah. Now, probably I can just take 2 more. Sorry? Oh, your essay question. Now, basically, that's not an economics question. That's a science question. You're saying this is about concentrations in the atmosphere. And you can say, where are we now? What kinds of concentrations is the maximum we can cope with? It might be 450, 500 in the short run, coming down pretty sharply after that. We're already at 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent. So you look at as it were, that time path and the maximum you can cope with, that will give you the total amount of greenhouse gases measured in CO2 equivalent that we can burn, and then you can go from that to the burning of the hydrocarbons. There's a big literature. If instead of coming to this lecture, you just spent 10 minutes Googling, you would have found instantly Miles Allen at this university has done those sums. Many people have done those sums. We can't really emit much more than 20 years at the rate we're already emitting, and that's one way of putting it. But as I say, there's a huge literature on this, and it's pretty straightforward in principle. So you've got plenty of time between tonight and tomorrow. So just a couple more. Are there no more ladies who want to ask a question? There's here and here. Please, this lady just here. No, I didn't mean you, but if you're very quick, you can.
Can you envision success without increased reliance on nuclear energy?
Yeah, short question. Yes, please.
I was wondering how the big increase in the use of renewables will change the geopolitics of resources, energy resources. I mean, that must be a big change.
Yeah. David? There's one here, sorry. This distinguished gentleman just here.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for a lovely talk. David Hendry. It's more a plug for the UK, which I know is a bit player in the world these days, but we have brought our emissions per capita down from 12 tonnes per person per year to 6 tonnes per person per year. We've almost got rid of coal, and much of it is due to the 2008 Climate Change Act, which hasn't got a very high price in carbon, but it's really had a massive impact in the last few years. So although the world CO2 rose at the fastest level ever, we dropped by 7 megatons last year.
Right. Can I see a solution without nuclear? Yes. Would I suggest trying to do it without nuclear? No. This is such a big problem that we have to look at everything that we've got. Secondly, of course, nuclear in an electricity system produces, your base load in different kinds of ways. And maybe we'll be charging up our electric cars on French nuclear overnight. Who knows? But if the question is, could we do it without nuclear? Yes, I think we could. Is it sensible to drop something that is potentially very big like that? I don't think so. And the future of nuclear is in large measure in China. They will build probably 100, 150 1 gigawatt power stations in the next 15 years or so. We don't know exactly how many. That will be the one place where we'll learn about nuclear on scale. And we need to learn. We need to learn. The renewables and the geopolitics, well, essentially, if you just think of the economics, if you want people to stop producing and consuming hydrocarbons, then for consumers, the price has to be high, and for producers, the price has to be low, because producers produce off the producer price and consumers consume off the consumer price. So if you want consumption demand to go down, the price has to be high to consumers. And if you want production to be low, then the price to producers has to be low. The difference, of course, is policy. Now, as I've told it, it's a carbon price. But of course, as I've argued, there's much more to policy than just the carbon price. That, of course, means that what we call the economic rents to extracting hydrocarbons will drop very rapidly. That's the point of the policy. Yeah? So to the extent that geopolitics depends on economic rents from hydrocarbons, yes, it will change geopolitics. That's part and parcel. It's part of the logic of the whole story. But it's quite remarkable how fast some of those who are living in large measure off the rents of hydrocarbons are moving very quickly towards renewables as well. The Gulf states are moving remarkably fast. Now, David's question. But it's fine if geopolitics changes. It's okay. The UK has, since 1990, has seen growth of roughly 60% and reduction in emissions of roughly 40%. It's been pretty good, yeah. And the Climate Change Act, there are 5 people who voted against, and we know who they are. But that was a wonderful example of cross-party collaboration. And if you want to have strong, consistent policy, you really need cross-party involvement. And sometimes it happens. That time it did happen. It came into the legislation and it stayed there. Now, there are people who sort of wheedle at the edges and push a bit, but it's actually been pretty robust. But we have to look after it, but it's a very impressive story, and we don't get everything wrong.
Thank you, Nick. I think we could go on all night, and we have to eat. Thank you for a wonderful talk. It was inspiring as ever, and I think everybody here learnt something, and I think we go forward. So let's thank the speaker again. Thank you very much.